Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Elam Rotem, and today we'll talk about some aspects in the early 17th century monody. Polyphonic music in the 16th century, which then was simply referred to as music, had rather understandable rules. However, when we look at monodic music from the beginning of the 17th century, that is, music for only one voice and accompaniment at the time of the first operas, we are often left confused, seeing many rules of counterpoint being constantly ignored. But were the rules really being ignored? Or there were simply new ways to compose and notate music? In this episode, we'll try to decode early 17th century monody, and hopefully learn how to understand it better. As a first step, let's quickly examine what the so-called pseudo-monody of the 16th century is, and how it changed towards the turn of the 17th century. Literally, the term monody refers to music that consists of only one part, as opposed to polyphony, which consists of several parts. In the 16th and 17th centuries, however, there is no such thing as music for only one voice. When using the term monody, it is understood that we are talking of one voice and accompaniment. Now, before music for one voice and accompaniment was actually composed, there was a practice of performing polyphonic music with only one singer and accompaniment. That is, instead of each part from the piece being sung, only one is sung, and the other parts are played by instruments, either by several instruments or only by one that is capable of playing all the parts, such as a keyboard instrument or a lute. This practice became popular in the course of the century, and some pieces were even originally composed with the intention that they be performed in this manner. This is sometimes called pseudo-monody by scholars, because it's not originally a piece for one voice and accompaniment, it is a polyphonic piece which is only performed as a monody. A true monody is a piece where the inner parts are no longer an essential part of the composition. The composer writes only the solo voice and the accompanying bass, and the inner parts are to be completed by the performer, based on the assumption that he has sufficient musical understanding for the task. This bass line that requires completion by the performer is of course the basso continuo, and such pieces for only one solo voice and basso continuo were starting to appear towards the end of the 16th century. They are found in all genres: love songs, serious liturgical music, and of course the first musical dramas, which we now call the first operas. An early source for secular monodies is Caccini's famous Nuove Musiche from 1602. Both the name, new music, and the detailed preface tell us a lot about this genre. Cavalieri's Lamentations are a source for early liturgical monodies, composed sometime before 1600. There we find highly expressive and chromatic music. And in regard to musical dramas, the earliest surviving examples are by Peri and Caccini, in their versions of Euridice from 1600. The common thing to all of these genres is that they were all developed towards the end of the 16th century, and by the first decade of the 17th century were booming in the publishing houses. The new monody was a hit on the market. One of the intentions of the new monody was to communicate the text in a clearer and more direct way than the older and rather clumsy polyphony. If desired, it was possible to recite a whole verse in one musical gesture, and this was definitely used in the context of the first musical dramas, which were more drama with music than music with drama. But the capability of reciting text with music was not new for singers. They were expected to do it already in church. Let's see. In the second half of the 16th century in Italy, somewhere between simple Gregorian chant and complicated polyphony, lies the so-called falsebourdon, a simple musical skeleton, typically for 4 parts, that psalm text can be sung to. It was a quick way to upgrade psalms largely intoned on the recitation tone into very simple polyphony. This always included a moment where the singers were required to recite a portion of text on a single note. As it was in fact not possible to faithfully transcribe a recitation using the rather rigid Western notation, the way they notated it was often by using one long note on which the text should be fitted and recited. Here is an example from one of Rufo's falsebourdoni with sound text I added. I'll sing the bass part.
Virgam virtutis tuae mitet Dominus exeion. Dominare in medio inimicorum tuorum.
Going back to our subject, in the new monodies of the early 17th century, we rarely find the falsebourdon notation. Instead, the composers try to notate things more accurately, note for note. However, it is clear that a precise rendition of the notation would be too rigid and would lack the desired speech-like recitation and sparkling sprezzatura we read about in the sources. An interesting exception, although not a monody, is the madrigal Sfogava con le stelle by Monteverdi, where he did use falsebourdon notation when he wanted all the voices to recite together. In contrast, in the composer's famous prologue to Orfeo, which is strikingly similar to the beginning of Sfogava con le stelle, he used normal notation. It seems though that the final result should be more or less similar, recitar cantando, something between reciting and singing. With the help of the accompaniment of a chitarrone, I'll sing the beginning of Sfogava con le stelle with its falsebourdon notation, followed by the opening of Orfeo's prologue.
Sfogava con le stelle un infermo d'amore. Dal mio permesso amato a voi ne vegno.
To sum up, the recitations found in the early 17th century monody, in addition to their more obvious origins from poetry and drama, came also from the common practice of reciting falsebourdoni in church. When we see a bunch of repeated notes and a lot of text in a monody, we should remember that the notation is just a necessity, the best way to notate something which is not really possible to notate. It is then our task to find a way that will feel natural for us to recite it in a flowing and articulated manner. The next thing that we'll notice when we look into monodies is some weird progressions. We'll see phenomena that seem to contradict the known rules of counterpoint. Now, it's also true that at this exciting period, some composers did break the rules, but many others didn't really. We just have to understand better what they meant. Let's see. There are three main reasons for things to seem a bit weird in early 17th century monodies. 1. When the melody jumps between assumed voices. 2. When ornaments are written out. And 3. When anticipation notes are used. Let's examine this short phrase from Caccini's monody, Muovetevi a pietà. I'll sing it.
Morendo me.
You might have noticed that Caccini used the dissonant interval of a seventh. He prepared it on the note before, fine, but alas, he did not resolve it correctly. Instead of resolving it by descending one step to D, he illegally jumped away from the dissonance all the way down to A. As a Renaissance bicinium, a piece truly for two voices, this would not be allowed. But here we have more than only two voices. Along the solo voice, we have the accompaniment, the basso continuo, that contains in itself a kind of contrapuntal framework. If we were to reconstruct this contrapuntal framework in 4 parts, it might have looked more or less like this. In such a context, the parts are expected to act according to the rules, but in the case of a monody, the solo voice is able to jump between the parts of the assumed contrapuntal framework, thereby creating unusual and expressive melodic lines that would seem to defy the rules of counterpoint. Such seemingly wrong melodic lines are found very often in the early 17th century monody. For the most part in the 16th century, vocal pieces were notated without any ornamentation or diminutions. On top of the composed notes, performers were expected to add little ornaments such as trilli, gruppi and accenti, as well as more complicated diminutions. Towards the turn of the 17th century, however, small ornaments were often written out in the pieces and started to be considered as inseparable parts of the composition. They became even more inseparable when they were not just melismas that one can omit or replace, but also carried text syllables. From this point on, if we fail to recognize the written out ornaments, we might get rather confused when trying to read the music. A good example is one of the most common ornaments, the accento. The historical descriptions of the accento are not always consistent, but often they describe an addition of an auxiliary upper note before a descent of one step, like so. And here is a generic example where the accento is only a melisma.
Accento.
You see and hear that the accento note is dissonant with the bass, and according to proper counterpoint this would not be approved. Yet, it's very beautiful and became an integral part of the musical language in the 17th century. Now, if the accento also carries a text syllable, the phenomenon is even amplified, like here.
I dolci accenti.
So, once composers started using these ornaments as a built-in component in their pieces, we find more and more of these wrong notes in their music, and we like it. Anticipation notes, as their name suggests, anticipate the note or harmony that follows them, even if it means that for a little while they will be completely dissonant with the current harmony. Here is a generic example.
Normal consonant note, anticipation, anticipation, anticipation.
Now, anticipation is not limited to anticipating the following note, it can also anticipate the following harmony, as we can see in the spine-tingling A-flat at the beginning of the third act of Monteverdi's Orfeo.
Scorto da te mio nume, speranza, speranza, unico bene dell'afflitti mortali.
Again, we see that what at first appears to be a completely random note actually has a clear reason to be there. By the way, such anticipation is not exclusive to the early Baroque. Check the footnote for a nice anticipation in the song Three Little Birds by Bob Marley. One of the most prominent components found in early 17th century monodies is cadences. In fact, if one were interested in pointing out the main difference between classical Renaissance counterpoint and the music of the early 17th century, the answer would be the number and strength of cadences. In the 16th century, composers jumped through hoops in order to avoid strong cadences, and allowed only several such cadences in each piece. Toward the turn of the 17th century, however, it seems that there was no longer any shame connected to using strong cadences every 2 bars. Appearing at the end of each musical sentence, cadences play a big role in clarifying the syntax of the music, and especially in monodies. The cadential components have a certain inherent flow and gravity. Therefore, recognizing and appreciating the cadences will help us find the direction of the phrase. This is not the moment to delve into the fine details of cadences, but we'll hopefully do it another time. Now, let's have another look at Monteverdi's Orfeo, this time at the first appearance of Eurydice. In these 8 bars there are no less than 5 cadences. All seem like two-step authentic cadences. As you know, for such cadences, at least 3 components are necessary: tenorizans, cantizans, and bassizans. Therefore, in addition to the 2 composed parts, we need to find the missing 3rd component in each cadence, and include it in the accompaniment. In authentic cadences, the bass always takes the bassizans, so we can focus our attention on the voice. In the first cadence, it takes the cantizans, so we need to add the tenorizans. In the second, third, and fourth cadences, it takes the tenorizans, so we need to add the cantizans. Take care, it's making a dissonance, so it must be prepared in advance. And on the last cadence, it takes neither the tenorizans nor the cantizans, so we have to add both. By the way, if you are not familiar with these terms, feel free to check out our episode about cadences. Now we have all the components we need to help us construct our accompaniment. As we said, understanding the cadences may help us with the flow of the music. One of the reasons for this is that the point of the cadence with the greatest weight, the penultimate step, the moment that the cantizans dissonances with the tenorizans, is also where the accents of the textual phrase is found. In almost all cases, the main accent of the text line is on the penultimate syllable. In this case, excluding the first line, this is exactly where Monteverdi sets the cadences. Thus, reciting this text correctly and singing this text with Monteverdi's music should be similar in its flow towards the penultimate moment of every line. Before I sing it for you, make note of the beautiful and dissonant anticipation notes, and to the 2 accenti, one at the beginning, and if you want, an upside down one before the end.
Io non dirò qual sia nel tuo gioir, Orfeo, la gioia mia, che non ho meco il cuore, ma te costassi in compagnia d'amore. Chiedilo dunque a lui, s'intender brami, quanto lieta gioisca e quanto t'ami.
So, in this episode, we try to shed a bit of light on early 17th century monodies, which very often confuse the critical reader. However, although one might think from this video that everything may have an explanation or logic behind it, this is unfortunately not the case. At this period, many composers experimented and did very weird things that defy any explanation or logic. This is also part of the charm of this era, but it should not encourage us to state that all the rules were broken and everything was allowed. In most cases, a reason can be found, and I hope that the tools presented in this episode may help, even if only a little. This was our show about early 17th century monody. We hope you enjoyed it. Many thanks to Harmelin for his chitarrone accompaniments. Don't forget to check the special page on our website with all the footnotes and other extra information. Feel free to comment, share and like, and see you next time at earlymusicsources.com.